On August 14th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln invites 5 free Black men to the White House for a meeting. They are part of the Black elite in Washington, D.C., and he wants to have a conversation with them. The Civil War has been going on for about a year, and Abraham Lincoln is worried because the war is not going well. And because it's not going well, he's feeling like he might have to do something drastic. He's considering taking this very radical step of liberating all of the enslaved people who are in the Confederate States. And he's thinking about doing this as a war tactic, understanding that if he takes away the South's labor force, that might cripple them, or at least the threat of it would force them to remain in the Union. But he's also concerned about what it might mean to suddenly free 4 million enslaved people and what the consequences of that might be. I can imagine these 5 distinguished men are very excited to get Lincoln's invitation. They are abolitionists. They have been pressuring Lincoln to abolish slavery. But when they get there, they are greeted by President Lincoln and another man. His name is James Mitchell. Now, James Mitchell is a new employee. He's only been at the White House for a couple of days, and his job is a new job, and it's called Commissioner of Immigration. Now, that's immigration with an E, meaning his job was not to help people to enter the country, but to help people to exit it. Lincoln doesn't waste any time, according to documents that recount what happened that day. He tells the men that he had gotten funds from Congress to ship Black people, once they had been freed, to some other country. And then Lincoln said, "You and we are different races. Your race suffer very greatly, many of them, by living amongst us, while ours suffer from your presence. In a word," he said, "we suffer on each side." We are taught to think of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, and he was. But the truth is, like many white Americans, he was opposed to slavery because it was a cruel and unjust institution in opposition to this nation's ideals. But he was also opposed to Black political and social equality. As he said in a speech that he gave in 1853, he considered Black people a, quote, troublesome presence, and that they were incompatible with a democracy that was designed for white people. As he said in that speech, "Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not." As those 5 Black men stood in the White House, I wonder what it must have felt like. These men had been fighting for the liberations of millions and had waited for this moment, only to be told that once they were granted their freedom, they were going to be asked to leave the country of their birth. And to make it even worse, Lincoln then tells them that it's their fault that the country is fighting a civil war at all. He says, "Although many men engaged on either side do not care for you one way or the other, without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have an existence. That's why," the president said, "it is better for us both, therefore, to be separated." So Lincoln ends the meeting, and one of the men tells him that they will go back and consider his proposal. Lincoln then tells them, "Take your full time, no hurry at all." After that meeting, those men made it clear that they were not interested in taking Lincoln up on his offer to leave the country of their birth. There's a quote by a different group of Black abolitionists that really sums up the way that most Black Americans felt. And that quote said, "This is our home, and this is our country. Beneath its sod lie the bones of our fathers. Here we were born, and here we will die." After everything that Black Americans have been through in this country, that they didn't immediately take up Lincoln's offer and go somewhere else and start over is really an astounding testimony to their belief in the American ideals. By choosing to stay, Black people were saying, this is our country. We are American. And we're actually going to work to make these founding ideals a reality. And in the years that followed, after the Civil War ends, a very short period called Reconstruction began. And so you see the formerly enslaved pushing their white allies in Congress to start to change our founding document and to actually resolve those contradictions that were baked in. They do this through getting amendments passed. And of course, amendments are the way that we change our Constitution. So, of course, the very first amendment that they have to pass is the 13th Amendment, which abolishes the institution of slavery. And what's interesting about that is this is actually the first time that the word slavery is mentioned in the Constitution, is in the amendment that finally abolishes it. They passed the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment guarantees that all of the enslaved people will finally be citizens of the country of their birth. It also ensures for the first time that the laws cannot treat people differently based on their race. This is called the Equal Protection Clause, and this clause will be used again and again, really all the way up until now, to guarantee that all Americans are treated as equal citizens. And finally, they passed the 15th Amendment, which probably is the most important amendment when we're considering what a democracy is supposed to be. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote no matter what your race is. Now, it didn't include women at that time, but it certainly set the stage. And it, for the first time, guaranteed that whether you were born a person who was enslaved, whether you're white or you were Black, you had the right to exercise your vote in this democracy. The only reason we saw all of these gains in the South was because there were federal troops there, and those federal troops were holding back the violence of white Southerners who were not interested in seeing these gains. This all changes with the presidential election of 1876. It was a contested election, and Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican candidate. And remember, back then, it was Republicans who were the Progressive Party, and they were the party of Lincoln that was working to pass all of this progressive legislation. But Rutherford B. Hayes really wants to win this election. And so he makes a deal with the Democrats in Congress that if they give him their electoral votes, he will withdraw the federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. So he makes the deal and the troops leave. And we immediately see white Southerners implement a campaign to force Black people back into the position that they had been in before Reconstruction. The suppression of Black life over the next 5 decades would be so devastating that it would come to be known as the Great Nadir, the second slavery.
Tell you the truth, when I think of it today, I don't know how I'm living. I'm the oldest one that I know that's living. But still, I'm thankful to the Lord. Colored people is free, I ought to be awful thankful. If I thought that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. You're not a thing but a dog.
The day of days for America and her allies. Crowds before the White House await the announcement.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
Reporters rush out to relay the news to an anxious world and touch off celebrations throughout the country. Joy is unconfined.
It's February of 1946, and a young black man is sitting on a bus watching the Georgia pines fly past the windows. He's on his way to see his wife, and he's probably very excited because he's been away at war and he hasn't seen her in a very long time. He'd been fighting for this country in World War II, and just that day, he'd been honorably discharged for his service. But he is a black man who is returning to the Jim Crow South.
You can never whip these birds if you don't keep you and them separate.
The whole trouble with this integration business is it probably will end up with mixing socially.
But they tell me that I don't even have the right to fight to protect the white race.
We are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
Well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
What happened on that day is a story that would be told across the country.
Good morning, this is Orson Welles speaking. I'd like to read to you an affidavit.
It was a story that would actually change the course of history.
I, Isaac Woodard, Jr., being duly sworn, do depose and state as follows, that I am 27 years old and a veteran of the United States Army, having served for 15 months in the South Pacific and earned 1 battle star. I was honorably discharged on...
He's riding the bus through Georgia.
About 1 hour out of Atlanta, the bus driver stopped at a small drugstore.
He wants to get off and use the restroom.
He stopped. I asked him if he had time to wait for me until I had a chance to go to the restroom. He cursed and said no. When he cursed me, I cursed him back. When the bus got to
the bus driver gets upset with him, and they have a little bit of an argument. Woodard doesn't think much of it. He goes to the bathroom, runs back to the bus, and the bus keeps going. But then a few miles down the road, the bus stops. And the bus driver gets off the bus and then calls and tells Woodard that he needs to get off the bus as well. So Woodard gets off the bus, and before he can even utter a word...
When the bus got to Aiken, he got off and went and got the police. They didn't give me a chance to explain. The policeman struck me with a billy across my head and told me to shut up.
He's struck in the head by a police officer.
By my left arm and twisted it behind my back. I figured he was trying to make me resist. I did not resist against him. He asked me, was I discharged? And I told him yes. When I said yes, that is when he started beating me with a billy, hitting me across the top of the head. After that, I grabbed his billy and wrung it out of his hand. Another policeman came up and threw his gun on me and told me to drop the billy, or he'd drop me, so I dropped the billy. After I dropped the billy, the second policeman held his gun on me while the other one was beating me.
And the blows keep coming, and they keep coming, to the point that Woodard loses consciousness. Woodard is still wearing his crisp Army uniform. He's been discharged just a few hours earlier. When he comes to, he's in a jail.
I woke up next morning and could not see.
He was beaten so severely by that police officer that he would never see again. So Woodard's beating was not at all unusual. World War II had done exactly what many white people had feared, that once black people were allowed to fight in the military and when they traveled abroad and they experienced what it was like not to live under a system of racial apartheid, that it would be much harder to control them when they came back. Black men in their uniforms were seen as being unduly proud. So these men who had served their country, who would come home proudly wearing the uniform to show their service for their country, would find that this actually made them a target of some of the most severe violence. But what was unusual was what happened after. Woodard's case was picked up by the NAACP, and they take him on a bit of a tour where they're saying, look what happened to this man who served his country.
Dr. King, how are things shaping?
And that's largely seen as one of the sparks of the modern civil rights movement.
We have people coming in from all over the country. I suspect that we will have...
The second sustained movement of black people trying to secure equal rights before the law and an equal place in this democracy.
During the early weeks of February 1960, the demonstrations that came to be called the sit-in movement exploded across the South.
Negro youngsters paraded with placards, handed out literature, and tried to sit in at lunch counters.
I think on this day, many of us didn't realize just how important our movement would grow to be.
Official reaction was both swift and severe.
Don't blame a cracker in Georgia for your injustices. The government is responsible for the injustices. The government can bring these injustices to halt.
How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes, Glory! Hallelujah!
And in 1968, 350 years after the introduction of the first enslaved Africans into the colonies,
this Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us.
Congress passes the last of the great civil rights legislation
to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts.
It ends legal discrimination on the basis of race from all aspects of American life.
To eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
We often think of the civil rights movement as being about Black rights. But the civil rights movement was never just about the rights of Black people. It was about making the ideals of the Constitution whole. And so when you look at the laws born out of Black resistance, these laws are guaranteeing rights for all Americans.
This experience, which Black Americans were having, did not go unnoticed by the rest of America.
I mean, basically, every other rights struggle that we have seen.
Now, we fought the public accommodations fight 10 years ago with the blacks. We're going to have to start all over again with women.
Disability rights, gay rights, women's rights.
That people with disabilities were still victims of segregation and discrimination.
All come from the efforts of the Black civil rights struggles.
Equal rights to have a job, to have respect, not be viewed as a piece of meat.
No Americans will ever again be deprived of their basic guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Celebrations erupted on the steps of the Supreme Court.
One of its most momentous civil rights decisions, the Supreme Court found gay and lesbian Americans have a constitutional right
to marry. The majority found its justification in the 14th Amendment, written after the Civil War to extend equal protection under law to freed slaves.
So we are raised to think about 1776 as the beginning of our democracy. But when that ship arrives on the horizon at Point Comfort in 1619, that decision made by the colonists to purchase that group of 20 to 30 human beings, that was a beginning too. And it would actually be those very people who were denied citizenship in their own country, who were denied the protections of our founding documents, who would fight the hardest and most successfully to make those ideals real, not just for themselves, but for all Americans. It is Black people who have been the perfecters of this democracy. When I was a kid, I must have been in 5th or 6th grade, our teacher gave us an assignment. It was a social studies class, and we were learning about different places that people came from. And this was her way of kind of telling the story of the great American melting pot. So she told us all to research our ancestral land and to write a small report about it and then to draw a flag. I remember kind of looking up and making eye contact with the other Black girl who was in the class because we didn't really have an ancestral land that we knew of. Slavery had made it so that we didn't know where we came from in Africa. We didn't have a specific country, and we could say that we were from the whole continent, but even so, there's no such thing as an African flag. And so I remember going to the globe by my teacher's desk. It was on the window pane along the left side of the classroom, and spinning it to the continent of Africa and just picking a random African country. So I went back to my desk and I drew that random African country's flag and I wrote a report about it. And I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed, one, because I was lying. But I also felt ashamed because I felt like I should have some other country and that all the other kids could trace their roots elsewhere and I could only trace my roots to the country that had enslaved us. I wish now that I could go back and talk to my younger self and tell her that she should not be ashamed, that this is her ancestral home, that she should be as proud to be an American as her dad was, and that she should boldly and proudly draw those stars and stripes and claim this country as her own.